This conference will now be recorded.
Everybody, hi. All right, it's good to see you all here. So, welcome to Colloquium, and help me introduce Dr. Paulo Farah. He is a assistant professor in public administration right now. He's been here at WVU since 2014. And as we'll learn about in his talk today, he's got area of specialization in international law, a JD in international law, and then a PhD as well in international law. He has got an amazing kind of geographical journey. He has spent time, let me see, the JD was in Paris. The PhD was in England.
Between Italy and France.
I'm wrong. Spent extensive amount of time doing research in China. He has been a research fellow at Georgetown as well as Harvard University, and we've had him here since 2014 here at WVU. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk. I also, we invited Paulo to come talk with us because we saw that his work in a lot of ways really helps kind of bridge geology and geography. He has a very strong side of aspect of his work with humanitarianism and people and society, but also does a lot of work focusing on water and governance and policy related to very physical and physical processes. So we felt like it was a really nice bridge to hear you talk. So would everyone just please join me in welcoming Paulo, and it'll begin. And also formality, passing around the assignment sheet. So if you are a geography colloquium, you just check off in here. This is the geology grad student sign in, and I regret to say there's extra credit being offered for colloquium today. So if you're in 386 or 286, also cited in the sheet. We'll have a follow up about that later. Okay, you need a pencil? All right. All right, I am done. Please. Do you want me to change the lights a little? It seems great.
I think it's okay. Yeah.
Is that better? I think you see the screen. Okay.
For them, if they can see better.
Is that good, everyone? We're good? Okay.
Great.
All
Thank
right.
you very much. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Karen, for the invitation, and also for the Department of Geology and Geography. That's great to be here, and to everyone I've been speaking for this event. As you mentioned, Karen, I work on different areas on law and public policy. I'm in the Department of Public Administration. So I'm also teaching courses that looks into the democratic context of public administration, meaning also what is constitutional respectful, what is the non-administrative process, what the administrators can do for improving the context in the US, but also in the international context. And the other class I'm teaching also is on public policy and problem analysis that helps also to frame what we are going to talk today. And just an additional word, I've been hired to WVU with the Shale Gas Initiative. That's now is the Center for Innovation on Research Gas Utilization. Tim Carr reminded me that it was in my hiring committee today. I remember that very clearly. So I'm very glad to be here because I feel that everything that your department is doing is very close to me, both parts, both geology and both geography. But the presentation for today will be focusing particular on an area I developed. I have already published some articles on the area of intangible cultural heritage. And to give you a broader perspective on how I frame this analysis. I frame this analysis from the perspective of my main research topics, which is the impact of globalization on sustainable development and human rights. So how we can try to balance globalization and human rights, and globalization and sustainable development, if we can. Or at least we should endorse and we should try to acknowledge which are the challenges of these difficult sometimes relations. And I was talking also with some of your colleagues, GAs and master students during lunch that were asking me, but this is not just a conflict between trade and globalization and human rights. It might be a conflict even among values. Yes, that's absolutely true, meaning that when you are trying to respect and protect human rights, you might maybe affect the environment. And vice versa, when you're trying to protect the environment, you might affect somehow the human rights. And that will be something that we can try to analyze during this presentation. So this research on intangible cultural heritage is inside this broader perspective of globalization and how the impact of issues that they are discussed at the international level, and they try to rationalize and formatting in one single way, because when you are trying to have an international treaty or an agreement among countries, you need to consider the differences, but at the same time you need to arrive to an agreement, to a compromise that's try to make everybody the happiest or the less unhappy as possible. But sometimes this is not possible. Cultural heritage and intangible cultural heritage is one of the areas where it has been extremely difficult to reach agreements at international level, even though there are some of those agreements at UNESCO level, or also at the WIPO level, World Intellectual Property Organization level. But some of those important elements, like the intangible cultural heritage, we don't actually have overall agreement at the international level. So both the UNESCO and the WIPO, since there was this difficulty to reach some kind of understanding and compromises among countries, says the countries that wants to protect intangible cultural heritage needs to do it domestically, needs to do it at the highest level as possible domestically, to protect your own interests, for your indigenous people, for your own traditional knowledge, for your own intangible cultural heritage. So that's the starting point of the research that we will be covering a little bit today. So first of all, what is intangible cultural heritage, and which are the risks for intangible cultural heritage? Specifically, the intangible cultural heritage is everything which is not physically tangible, with some exception that we will be seeing in a moment. And the risk for the intangible cultural heritage are exactly the employment of indigenous knowledge to generate a commercial product, meaning a commodification of something that it's not, which is absolutely not commercial, but becomes commercial in the hands of people or companies or stakeholders that would like to make it a profit from something which is in itself, it's not a product. Of course, a big exception is the drug, because you are using something which is actually tangible, and you're making a valuable drug. This is an employment that's generated from a physical product, like, for example, Chinese traditional medicine or some traditional knowledge element that becomes part of a specific drug. Outside that, all the others are the use by outsider of tribal names, other identifiers like sacred symbol or image or artistic designs, or those are intangible, but all those have specific values that are defined into the area of human rights, because all the symbols for certain indigenous people are so connected to their traditions, to their groups, that must remain private, must remain connected to their own understanding, and should not be revealed outside and should not be disclosed outside the indigenous groups. Also, some imaging and some artistic designs of these indigenous people might be used for products, meaning you take these symbols and you produce T-shirts, or you produce other products that can be commercialized, and that affects, of course, the privacy of these groups that would see this use as a misappropriation of their own identity for reasons that they are not related to their own groups and their own interests. So the commodification of an intangible cultural property is exactly the translation of an intangible cultural property into articles of economic worth. that you try to make a business and you try to make a commercial profit by the means of categories that are absolutely, if not sometimes completely not understood or not even accepted by certain indigenous communities, like license, rental, or sale, because as some of you probably know, certain indigenous people do not have even the category of property. So when you go even at the level of rental or license or sale of their own cultural heritage, transfer in a product, that's even a step further. But we will be coming back in a moment on these specific issues. So when you are exploiting and commercializing something that does not belong to you, like something that belongs to an indigenous community, you are making a misappropriation. So you are using something in a way that it's not acceptable. Does it mean that this is a violation of a law or regulation? Unfortunately, most of the time it is not, because these intangible cultural heritage elements are not protected. For the simple reasons that the communities do not see as something that is in danger, or they even do not consider that the categories of protection that is given by our society can be used by them, or even they don't know about them. But once again, this will be analyzed. What are the attempts that we can do for protecting intangible cultural heritage with categories that exist in our society? The first attempt can be to try to use copyrights as an instrument for protection for the intangible cultural heritage. So the attempt of this presentation is to try to make an overview of the possible ways to protect intangible cultural heritage, but the conclusion will be that unfortunately they're not sufficient and we need to look further. So the very first problem, if we try to use copyrights to protect intangible cultural heritage, copyrights is the protection of authors. So if you write a book and you publish a book, you are protected in your copyright. Let's see if we can use it for intangible cultural heritage, if this category is applicable. For copyrights, we need an identifiable author. So if you are a scholar, you're publishing a book, you are obviously identifiable. But for intangible cultural heritage, the expression, the intangible cultural heritage are expression deriving from previous different generations through reiteration. If you do not have the issue of the time and the reiteration and generation, you don't actually have an intangible cultural heritage. You do have something very, very temporally limited, so it's not an intangible cultural heritage. And the intangible cultural heritage is without a specific identified author, because you do have an indigenous community that you try, and there you need absolutely the study from anthropologists, historians, and geographers as well, to try to understand for how long that specific culture, intangible cultural heritage has been part of that specific community in that specific place in that specific time, and for how long. But this shows you that already the very first element of copyright, the identifiable author, makes clear that there is a conflict, so it's not possible. The other element of copyright is exactly the temporary protection. So the society attributes a copyright for protecting the innovation of an author, of a scientist, for a certain period of time. This is not an indefinite protection, because at a certain point that specific product becomes available to the rest of the society for the growth of the rest of the society. If we look to intangible cultural heritage, by contrary, we have a perpetual cultural property rights, which is correlated to collectivity and to collective efforts of a community. Meaning that if we want to protect intangible cultural heritage, once again, copyrights are not enough, because they protect just temporarily. And here we need to find a way to protect consistently over time. And then the third element is the fixation. To be able to have a copyright, it needs to be clear, it needs to be fixed what you are protecting. When, by contrary, most intangible cultural heritage are of oral nature, so they're not written, they're not physically fixed in a text or in a document. So it's something that, once again, show you the difficulty of using copyrights to protect intangible cultural heritage. What about patents? And once again, I stress, this is not something that indigenous people are automatically searching for protection through copyrights, patents, or it's an attempt to see if the current system in our society is helpful or not for protecting intangible cultural heritage. Copyrights, it seems, is not enough or is not sufficient. What about patents? So we do have, from one side, patentability. So the fact of having a patent needs to respond to certain requirements given by the different governments that register a specific patent. So there should be certain elements. And the very first element of patentability is that you need to have a specific technology that you are patent and protecting through a patent. But intangible cultural heritage are of non-technological nature, even though, as I mentioned already at the very beginning, some intangible element of traditional medicine may be protected under patents, okay? But in general, the majority of intangible cultural heritage are non-technological. So immediately there is a problem. You cannot have a patentability because it's missing the technological nature. Then another element to be able to register a patent is the novelty, the inventive step. Because if you are an expert in something and somebody else has already registered a technology, you need to be able to register a new patent. You need to show that you improved the previous technology in a way that deserves to be granted a new patent. So this inventive step requirement. But intangible cultural heritage is exactly the opposite. So traditional knowledge needs to be previously used for long periods to be seen as culturally related to an indigenous community, to a community specifically. So it's not an inventive step, it's actually something that has been corroborated through the years as part of the community. And so once again, this novelty or inventive step is not there. And the other element is the inventiveness as an achievement of individuals. It can be one, it can be a series of people, but needs to be clearly identifiable. Who are the people who have made an invention, this innovative step? And once again, the intangible cultural heritage has this element of collective nature that it's necessary to be able to be considered as a traditional knowledge. Once again, patents do not help. So as we are trying to see these relations between intellectual property rights and intangible cultural heritage, there are additional shortcomings that we need to list and express. That first of all, the assumption about ownership and property related to intellectual property rights, which is an immediate element, because in many communities, indigenous communities, do not have the concept of property, even less the concept of intellectual property, which is part of again of the bigger issues about property rights that certain scholars on critical legal and policy studies contest the current idea of our society on how it's set in terms of designing the property rights as in certain countries and in certain areas as a way of domination, of dominance on certain other population or part of the population. So there is immediate divergency between ownership and property in intellectual property rights and what can be seen in studies of cultural heritage, where property is seen not as an help, but as a problem against the communities. If we take geographical indication, for example, geographical indication are again part of the bigger idea of bigger regulation of intellectual property. Geographical indication, if I can make an example for those who do not know about that, geographical indication, it's very important, for example, for food products or for other products that you really want to have the Italian cheese in your table. You don't want to have an Italian sounding cheese produced in Germany. You really want to have the Italian or French cheese. Geographical indication is the fact that it's connected to a product, a specific connection to the fact that has been produced in that specific region, even not in that specific country, but in that specific city or region of that country, that tells you that that product is a specific quality. So geographical indication are very important and might be used positively for protecting culture, because sometimes these food products, cheese or wines or beers, might be very cultural related to that specific town or that specific city or that specific region. So there is a very important element of culture in the discussion about geographical indication. But unfortunately, even this, that they are the closest concept within the concept of intellectual property right, geographical indication, do not provide protection for cultural expression per se, but merely for the reference with its territorial origin. And we perfectly know that indigenous communities do not always stay in the same place. They move. They sometimes are transboundary, a movement from a state to another state through the history. So they are bringing with themselves their culture, but they do not always stay in the same place. By contrary, geographical indication, when you want to protect certain products that do have a cultural element, must be related to a geographical place specific that is there, is not changing over time. So once again, even geographical indication are not fully helpful. So there is an inappropriateness of many expression of intangible cultural heritage to meet the requirements demanded to receive protection according to the current intellectual property rights regimes. And you could say, why we really care? We really, if the indigenous community do not care about intellectual property rights are not sufficient, why we do care? We do care because this is an attempt to try actually to protect the interest of the indigenous community to be able to control their broader meaning of human rights. But let's continue. And once again, which is the other shortcoming? The cost of intellectual property rights implementation and enforcement. It's lengthy and generally is expensive in terms of administrative and judicial procedures. So when you want to activate for a patent or for a copyright or for a protection of a trademark, if you need to have a specialist that follow this kind of administrative procedures that are sometimes expensive and long, so not exactly perfect for indigenous communities. Might have many different cultural heritage, can be even dozens and more in a single community. So what can be the possibility? It's the possibility to try to think about a sui generis adaptation of intellectual property rights. Sui generis means ad hoc, specific for the situation of the intangible cultural heritage that goes beyond the actual current regulation in a way that, as I said at the beginning, you think and you criticize, you simply do not take for granted what is there, but you try to make recommendation for changes. Sometimes I was speaking with experts in intellectual property and they were saying, what do you think about the balance of intellectual property and development? And they were responding to me, you are meaning which are the current development of intellectual property rights? No, I was not meaning that. I was meaning really how to balance intellectual property with development, even sustainable development, in a way that intellectual property is not affecting negatively development, even in developing countries, so developing of the population. So one way can be exactly to try to adapt intellectual property rights in a broader terms with other ways. Which are these other ways? So I explained before copyrights, and now a suggestion can be of a creation of the concept of communal copyrights, which is a recognition of communal copyrights to be granted to traditional communities. So it would be a new category, so that doesn't exist specifically, because as I said before, copyrights should be for a specific author, a group of authors which are identifiable. Is why not trying to create a category that can say, this is a communal copyright for that community specifically, for that specific cultural heritage, that consider that does not belong to a specific person, but belongs to the community itself and goes through generations. So it goes through the generations and so belongs to the community and not to a specific person. The copyright legislation granting communities, I'm checking the time, I don't know how many more minutes I have now, the granting communities the right to exercise moral rights, meaning that if you do have a right, then you need to be also able to exercise it, to protect it. So if you are an author and somebody use your book and publish it as it's his book, you can go to the court and you can appeal against that. We need to be able to grant these rights of exercise moral rights to protect against inappropriate, derogatory, or culturally insensitive use of traditional-based copyright material to the community. And then an establishment of a national body or office designed to promote the interest in the community was the intangible cultural heritage and is endangered, because we do have within agency clear protection, even in different countries, not only in US, for cultural heritage when they are physical nature. You protect the museum, you protect a sculpture, you protect a cathedral. Why not, at the same time, to protect an intangible cultural heritage that is part of that country cultural characteristics, if that specific indigenous community have a specific history and sensitivity and characteristics. How to do that? So beside the communal copyrights is also an extensive interpretation of the right to privacy against potential intrusion or theft to protect the enjoyment of an individual and collective private sphere. Because for now, privacy is considered for your own self, but not for the community. So there is not a real possibility to activate privacy against a violation of an interest of a community. But why not? Since the regulation on privacy exists, and since a certain element of intangible cultural heritage are so connected to the individuals and to the community within the individuals, with extensive interpretation of privacy concept and regulation, that there might be a possibility to, in that way, to protect this intangible cultural heritage. And then trade secret law as well. So there is a statutory approach having the objective of symbol and rituals that people legitimately attempt to keep private or internal to the community. Trade secret law generally is when you are in Apple or Microsoft and you change company, you have to sign an agreement that you are not disclosing and you are not bringing out and selling the knowledge you have got from your previous job. This is also can be somehow adopted in this context, because one of the big problems is exactly that in many communities, certain members of the communities, they left the communities and they try to profit from their traditional knowledge of their communities when they left the communities for any reason, because they were not belonging to the community anymore. And so trade secret law can somehow protect not the person, actually, the community against those who are leaving the community and they are trying to profit for their private and internal elements to the community. Other areas that all the law that are considered crucial to the protection of intangible cultural heritage is also the enactment of provision of contract law setting forth prerequisite to contract addressing the commercial exploitation of such heritage, meaning that if you want to have a contract between a t-shirt producer or the song that has been used, a component of the music from traditional music from an indigenous community, there should be a prior informed consent from the community. Meaning that if a person then signs this contract with the company and does not reveal that that product is not his own product, but is also coming from cultural heritage of the community was belonging to, or maybe was been able to steal from the community or to get to know about that. If there is not this prior informed consent and representation, meaning that the community had told that this person can represent the community with a specific company or business, then that contract is invalid, meaning that that specific product needs to be taken away from the market, needs to be compensate the community and the impact on their privacy or on their cultural heritage. So the subject matter here is the tangible expression of intangible cultural heritage, meaning the intellectual property transfer and license contract related agreements on granting access to the possible use of relevant heritage, and sales agreement related to the tangible manifestation of heritage. There is a lot of business. So the community are not happy of that because they would have preferred that no one would have interfered. But if something happened, at least they can be compensated to be able to then reestablish their specific and taken away the products from the market if they were not giving this prior informed consent and representation. All this is in the sphere of the defensive protection in terms of tort of cultural misappropriation, so meaning actions that can try to reestablish or to protect from the misappropriation, which is outrage to the community's self-respect and identity, particularly when there is an employment by non-indigenous people of their native symbols, songs, dances, words, and other forms of cultural expression. So the proposal is indeed to have an anti-cultural misappropriation regime that certain countries that are more recently tried to implement, even though not as broad as this idea, but to have a documentation of traditional knowledge, which cannot be done by public policy or public administration lawyers, needs to be done by anthropologists, historians, geographers, because they need to be inside the communities and being able to understand which are the evidence and the proof in the history of these communities of that specific traditional knowledge. Proof of the origin of this traditional knowledge, and also the prior informed consent, meaning that you need to have to understand if in that specific community you do have a representation, meaning it's the chief of the village, is a group of older people in the community, is represented, elected by the community that can deal with external parties about that and can be helped to understand that there are ways to protect their interest. So which are the conclusions, even though I went up of 3 minutes more or less, is the intellectual property seems to be an unsatisfactory foundation on which to build a viable cultural heritage legal edifice. So we need to try to focus on those aspects of community claims that can be addressed outside the intellectual property regime of patent and copyright, and also on a various elements of option for protection. And as I said in my and I had to my conclusions, this is a study that I did in the past years that I'm trying now to develop, and with an additional study on different countries, because like countries like New Zealand, Australia, Costa Rica, Brazil, several countries, after it was not possible to reach an international agreement for protecting intangible cultural heritage, they took domestic step forwards to adopt regulations having in mind their specific cultural domestic characteristics to adopt regulations and policy that they were trying to protect their national interest, to protect their national indigenous people. So that's the move forward research I would like to develop, and maybe in a year's time I will come back for giving you another lecture about this topic and further research, and I will be happy to share with you, and for now to hear your questions and being fully available to any further conversation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Everyone, we have a good 20 minutes or so for questions, so please.
Yeah.
That was really interesting. Could you talk a little bit about standing? Like, who is able to file like a complaint or a suit? And I'm thinking of two examples. One is Bruce Pascoe, who I don't know if you know in Australia. His indigenous history was like questioned by some of the ministers of the country. And then another much more local example with our the Moheganettes in Morgantown. I don't know if you're familiar with the Morgantown High School band has like some questionable costumes and dances for their Moheganettes. Are there any former Mohegans in here? I don't want to offend anybody, but it's a case where it's unclear like who would actually make a complaint exactly, because the misappropriation is so like generalized.
Yeah, it's the key of the topic here. Indeed, I didn't enter into details because the time was finishing, but the question helped me to go back one step to explain that. We're talking about so two different things here, but they are interconnected. We are talking about a person that makes goes out from a community and makes inappropriate use of certain intangible cultural heritage elements, and do it for its own personal gain, economic, generally business gain. So if there was not prior informed consent and representation on that person, so then it's questionable whether this person was having the possibility to do it. But the problem is that there is not a regulation that protect specifically if it's not adopted by the country, because now more and more, as I said, countries are doing it with domestic regulation, since an international one was not fully possible. I'm not saying that doesn't exist protection at the UNESCO level and the World Intellectual Property Organization level. Exist absolutely instruments to protect culture, but I'm now focusing on the intangible cultural heritage, which is more complex for the reason I explained before. So to respond specifically to your question, it depends by the country and the regulation of the country, because if it's within the country, there is a specific regulation that explain that there should be a prior informed consent and explain how the representation by the community needs to be put in place, then you do have arguments. But if there is not, there is actually no way to attack people who has misappropriately taken away this intangible cultural heritage. That's the meaning of the research. That's the meaning of the research, to try to develop, by contrary, and understand, based on the practice of different countries, since there was not the possibility to have an international one, which are the countries that are doing the best, considering the current situation, and say what they are doing, actually it's working there. It might work here as well, or it might work there as well. Of course, maybe not, because maybe the indigenous people or that specific historical context and cultural context of that country does not permit it. But that's really the question. And if I go back to here, when we are talking about communal copyrights and exercise of moral rights and establishment of national body, The point of this, the establishment of the national body or office is exactly the objective to try to tell that the country, so the state, needs to protect their own belongings, right? So you protect a cathedral, you protect a property of the country, you protect also the cultural heritage. So you need to have a national body that is going to make a list of the cultural heritage, because some of those are complicated. What does it mean, a list? So that you have a group of multidisciplinary people that goes within the communities and start to live and stay with the communities, understand which are the elements that might be in need of protection. Certain people say, yeah, but in that way, you create a buying list, meaning you are doing the work for those who want to steal it. If you're already detecting all the list of potential cultural heritage, you are predicting a purchase list. And then you go on Amazon, oh, thanks country, government, you give me the list, now I'm going to take them away. No, it is true that there is this risk, but from the other side, if there is not even a list with proof and evidence that that community for 250 years, 300 years has been having that cultural component in their community, and has been repeated and has been adopted through generation, you cannot even protect them in a court when somebody tried to steal it or steal it and use it. So that's really the objective. So the response is, it depends. It depends by the country, and it depends by the specific situation. So for the Morgantown one you mentioned now, I think it's difficult to see a regulation that can protect that, apart if there is any contractual violation or privacy that has been maybe signed by the school or by the people that have been told you cannot make use of this because that's with property of that specific community or individuals. So that meaning a violation of copyright, bluntly. So I don't see any other way like that. Yeah, but thanks for the question, because it helps me to clarify. Yeah, first and second. Yeah, first you. Yes.
Oh, okay.
And then you. Yes.
I'm wondering, like, is there another sort of fundamental way around sort of finding a way through the conflict? Because I'm thinking about how many indigenous communities have rules and practices around the cultural elements that they share, right? Like certain indigenous communities, like you have to do certain things in order to share songs, right? Or else you're in violation. So that if you come onto a particular geography or a particular space, there's a certain way that you have to be. And it seems that there's a set of rules around sharing and interacting with intangible cultural elements within these communities. And then there's a different sort of context and like value system with colonial societies, settler colonial societies. So like within this society right now, what's preventing us from just saying we recognize indigenous groups as fully sovereign nations, and what they tell us about their practices on these cultural things is what goes, and anything else other than that, we're in violation of it and we shouldn't be doing it. I mean, I know it's sort of like a
I got your point. So with the Native American treaties between the federal government and the indigenous population in the United States, there are certain things that are regulated, right? But not specifically, as far as I know, or not on for everything related to intangible cultural heritage. Actually, United States, fortunately, is one of the countries that has the least developed regulation for protection of intangible cultural heritage, even though it's one of the countries that has the most, or has the considerable regulation on the relations between federal and Native American population. So, and it's a specific even fact that it's a treaty between a federal government and Native American, like if they are foreign nations. We are talking about that. In other countries, that's not the same, right? We are talking about regulating the relation of minorities and groups within the collective idea that the country is the same country, considering other country, not the United States. So that's probably also because of the federalism in the United States. So like you regulate the relation between the central government and the states, you regulate also with the Native American groups. So the big issues is that those issues of the intangible cultural heritage were not taken into close account. And for now, I mean, United States is not not runner on these matters. Does not mean that there is nothing, but it's not front runner. So one of the objectives of this research is indeed to try to see which are the best experience also in other countries, having in mind international recommendation and reference point in terms of UNESCO and WIPO and other as well, because even the World Trade Organization, it's trade of cultural products. So there is a trade in goods and services, unfortunately. That's the thing. There are plenty of publications on trade and cultural issues that do not take specifically consideration intangible cultural heritage and the UNESCO and WIPO. So there are many parallel words that sometimes do not speak. And that brings me back to the questions at the beginning I was referring when we were talking with Jesse during lunch about the fact that even when you're talking about diverging values, environment and human rights, that everybody, I would believe in this room, I hope, that would agree that we need to protect the environment and we need to protect the human rights. But sometimes when you protect human rights, you are not protecting environment. Sometimes when you protect environment, you don't protect human rights. So that's the challenge, to be able to balance these diverging values, even among important values, to be able to strike the balance. So I hope I replied to your question.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up, and so I wonder what's the impetus for striking a balance. So like we think about the entity that is the United States presence on this land is not necessarily in balance with the indigenous people that have existed on this land, right? And so this is why indigenous people have been pushed off their land and relegated to reservations. And so in that, I'm just sort of wondering, and we can talk about it sort of after, why is there a need to strike a balance between a force that's invading and colonizing and regulating people, denying their sovereignty, and the people who are saying, we want to have our full sovereignty, we want to have control over our land like we always have, and practice these sorts of things?
You clarify greatly now. It's not a problem. I mean, when I'm talking about between federal government and the Native American states, I'm talking about the existing regulation, right? But it's even beyond the control of the federal government sometimes. What happened, think about multinational companies, that they're using the loopholes of national regulations to take advantage of what that specific country can provide, meaning that sometimes certain companies decide to relocate their business in a specific country because there is a lower protection of labor standards and labor regulation or environmental issues. And so they go there to profit the best, to be able to reduce the cost of the product, right? So we are not talking about an attempt from the US government to overrule or overcome the Native American people or population. We are talking about the fact that there are, even within the communities, people who get out from the community and try to benefit with companies and business sector beyond the government, and so even beyond the control of the federal government. So the Native American population, even the federal government, needs to work together to find the best deal to protect, because yes, it's sovereign nations within the borders. But if you have a company in China that take advantage of the intangible cultural heritage of a Native American population in US, what do you do? The Native American states cannot really act so strongly against Brazil or China or India or other countries, right? So, or even within the US, with business sector, if there are not the appropriate regulation to protect the affected interest, you just can't move forward. And having the possibility to appeal. So there was him, then Chris, and then Brendan. Yes?
Yes.
I'm sorry?
There's someone-
Oh, sorry, I didn't watch that.
Yeah.
So I'm happy with so many questions.
What about like when kind of I guess the indigenous body expands across multiple national boundaries? So for my example, it's like French wines are culturally protected by the French government. Spanish wines are not. When you have a region like the Basque region, which is a wine producing region that spans into both nations, how would something like that be regulated? Would that have to be regulated through something like UNESCO, WTO, or is that really going to depend on, I guess, which national body they align with, whether that be Spanish?
That's fortunately, that specific question, that's fortunately, it's regulated by, thanks to the geographical indication. So that's fortunately beyond the because it's an international, it's not worldwide, but at European level, there is a clear geographical indication regulation, which is sometimes in conflict with the perspective of the US, because for example, in the European perspective, the Italian sounding products, meaning an Italian that moved to UK and start to produce mozzarella, the real Italian mozzarella, can be somehow protected from the EU regulation. But if they are Italians move to US, unfortunately, the Italian sounding products is difficult for the Italian company to attack, because they are really being produced there in US from those people who have been relocated in US. So they are not lying, right? So there is that's a problem. So, but between France and Spain and Basque, it's within Europe, so it's possible through the geographical indication. So that specific issues, it's sorted out. Only that specific.
You mentioned about the communal copyrights and about how they'd be handed down generation to generation on those select groups and everything. How would we determine who would actually be part of those communities could access them? I think a recent example we look to would be when Elizabeth Warren, running for president, made comment that she was part of the Cherokee Nation, and they said no, she wasn't. How can we determine who is part of a group and who isn't? So we know, okay, somebody actually gets access to something that is part of their heritage or whatnot, and they don't risk, okay, I'm doing this, and they say I can't, even though they have evidence to back it up or whatnot. How do we determine who has access to it and who doesn't?
That's exactly the reason why you need a national body that try to work together with because in theory, the public sector or the civil service should be neutral and independent and over the different parties, and should be, I'm saying should be. And so that should be the role of the national body, to try to help and work with the communities. But even the very first step is to understand which is the community. Because we are talking about, as I said, maybe communities that stayed there for 200 years, but maybe others that they were moving, right? So cross-border between Canada and the US or other places, right? So first one is that. Then understanding what is the governance inside that community? Who are the decision makers? And every community is different. Is a matriarch community? Is a patriarch community? Is based on the age, the youngest people are the most cleverest and intelligent, or the older age is better. So different communities might have different standards. And so that question fit into this kind of research and work with individual communities that cannot be done but by kind of governmental or paragovernmental bodies, maybe with the work of the academics that are the experts in this area that can help to strike a balance on this. So I get your point very clearly.
I think a follow-up to it would be then, okay, then once we can figure that out, how do we actually determine who is in what community? Because somebody can say they are, and how do you deal without risking being discrimination against them by saying they are and whatnot? How do we handle on who is and who isn't, though, from there?
Yeah, that's the big question. You need to really have people working within the communities and having kind of using their way of decision making, saying, do we have a majority here? Is the community agreeable with this? So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying at all. So Chris, Brandon, then back to you. So Chris.
So I thought the comment about mozzarella was kind of interesting. And
I'm sorry, repeat again.
the comment you had about the mozzarella, the American,
Yes.
the Italian sounding
Yes.
name mozzarella, was interesting and actually went to the question that I had, which is the balance between individual rights of members of the community and the rights of the community. I think it goes to it because a member of the Italian community left Italy, moved to America. Does that member relinquish their rights to that intellectual property once they've left that community, if they decide to leave that community? I think that's sort of a...
So the big issue there is the divergences of regulation between Europe and US, because clearly in Europe is geographical indication. So you can remain an Italian, but if you are in US, you are not producing a product that is connected to that specific place. Is of course a problem also of knowledge of how to do the product, but is also a problem of land, of environment, of weather that makes that product so specific. And what you do there, it's not exactly the same in New Jersey, right? So that's the key issues. I'm saying New Jersey because there is a big community of Italians, right? The expatriates, or can be other places, can be even West Virginia. So that's really the big issues, and this different regulation. And in Europe, that would be protected, not in US, because there is not the same concept of geographical indications. So yeah.
So I'm thinking about one example that I've heard about recently, and that's Pixar, who use a lot of cultural appropriation in their recent movies, Moana being one of the Polynesian people. And then even, Frozen, they sent a team of animators to go live in Norway to study that. It's a more advantaged cultural heritage for sure, being from Norway and a wealthy country. But they were still using a lot of those cultural heritages and making a lot of money out. And I don't know what agreements. I know they said they worked with Polynesian people, but again, this could be the one person that enriched themselves from the benefit of the community. And just to hang this really interesting work onto some example that maybe is well known, at least of us that has kids that watch these movies.
Now, that's again, it's indeed an issue, because what happens depends on the evolution of the regulation and policy in that specific country, because if then the evolution brings to the fact that that country require, for signing a contract, require the prior informed consent and representation, then the contract it's valid until somebody file a case against it and try to make it invalid, right? So if it's prior to the regulation, you can do anything. But if after, if then there is an interest from someone to finger point that specific thing, it can be reversed by the court with the new regulation adopted by the specific country where the cultural heritage is taken from, not where the specific country where the cultural heritage is going to. Okay, so yeah, but yes, it's going even in the movies and cartoons, this kind of issues, because they are getting popularized. So yeah, that's a good point. I think there was
I think we have time for one more question.
one there, and Tim, maybe two.
Okay.
You and Tim. Hey, Tim, you had a question, right? Okay, yeah.
So we mentioned like food and like geographical copyrights. So like kind of like a general example, like the pierogi, from my understanding, is from Poland, but it's become like a big symbol to the city of Pittsburgh. I'm wondering if Pittsburgh would have any claim to the rights to the use of the pierogi, like the pierogi race, or as like a staple to the food there. Like who's to say they don't deserve those same rights, because people from Poland, people of Polish descent, helped build that city.
It's similar to the think of the mozzarella and thinking that that's at a certain point, if it goes to the trademark, then there is an international regulation that protects the trademarks at the level of the World Trade Organization and others. So if it has been registered, it's again very geographically oriented. So you might have a company, I make examples, company that based in the United States and didn't register its trademark in China or in Europe. And then, because it never thought that it would have become worldwide. As soon as there is the opportunities to become worldwide, you need to have an intellectual property manager taking care of all registration of these issues that we are moving now from the intangible cultural heritage to more regulation on IP rights, but that's perfectly fine. So, but it's connected, of course, but it's really IP law, what we are talking about now. So it means that if that company didn't take care of register its name and trademark in the other regions of the world, it's his mistake. So that there might be exactly another company, even if you think it's the same company, it's not, because somebody registered it. And so this happened, for example, with website, domain, right? Web domains. So certain companies register with the domain in the EU and didn't register .com or didn't register in other countries, and then it appears new companies in China or in India or in Japan or in other places, and they register. And so then there is you need to file a case and saying, no, I have invested, even if I didn't register, I have invested in that country. You need to show the investment. You need to show that you have made advertisement. You need to show that you have been present in the country sufficiently to demonstrate that if that other company is taking your name will create confusion in the consumers. It's not to protect you in that case. It's to protect the consumers, right? Not protect you company, but protect the consumer, because you are not protected because you didn't register in that country. So that's this simple, quick answer, but it's much more complex than that. But thanks a lot.
Trouble here, but we're talking about freedom of action in mozzarella in New Jersey. You know, freedom of speech, Scientology going after you, or the Mormon Church, or saying something's kosher when it's not. I mean, these are 1,000-year cultures, some are only 100-year cultures, but you have the freedom. When I was a young man, if you wore an American flag as a shirt, you could get arrested. I mean, that's an intangible cultural heritage of the United States, but I want to have the freedom to protest.
That's touch another area that is liberties and freedoms. That I'm not saying that they are outside
that's a balance of environment versus
absolutely. So the response is that specific. We are talking exactly of freedom of speech and
freedom of action, making mozzarella in New Jersey.
Exactly. So there are in this area, if you have a regulation that says that if you burn the flag, you are arrested. That's the specific regulation. You can agree or you can disagree, but that's the point. Then it's up to the in the U.S. if it gets to the Supreme Court to strike if that it's a violation of the Constitution, meaning that it's that is really regulated by the U.S. Constitution. Gets to that point because
when we go to a religious symbol like a cross.
Yes.
Put into a urinal.
Yes.
There's no U.S. regulation.
Exactly. So it's a political decision. What I'm saying is that at a certain point, as I was mentioning at the very beginning, the countries have the freedom to adopt regulations according to their own decisions. Meaning that if the United States has a regulation that protects the flag and does not have a regulation to protect other, for example, religious symbols, That's the choice of the United States, and maybe of the Supreme Court to say that the one of the flag is not okay, or the one of that is missing is not okay. But that's really the problem. So the issue is that it's political choice that drive public policy and transform public policy in regulation. Simple and bluntly, I would say. But I agree that it's an issue. It's an issue that touch from one side the freedom of expression, and from the other side the culture and the privacy. But that's the way it is. That's the way it is. For example, in certain countries, pornography is permitted. In other countries, you can have death penalty for pornography. So once again, those are choices of the individual countries, individual states. And that, for that reason, the borders and where you are living or are doing things counts a lot, because you do have a government and regulation that apply to that specific country. If you do exactly the same thing and you do it in Iran or in China, you might be not doing something legal, right? But thank you very much for all these questions.
For anybody who wants to continue the discussion, we're going to take us a few minute break, and then we're just going to move across the hall to 324 and kind of continue the discussion. So anybody and everybody is welcome to join us. I also just want to make note that we have